He thought she was debris. He thought she was nothing more than the starched white apron and the light blue fabric that clung to her frame, a piece of furniture that breathed and poured wine. He looked at her hands and saw servitude. He should have looked at her eyes and seen the predator waiting in the tall grass. It is a fatal error men of power often make, mistaking silence for submission and stillness for fear. But in the city of rain and neon, where the shadows stretch long enough to hide sins, the waitress, known as Imani, was not merely surviving the night shift. She was hunting, waiting for the moment when the mask could slip, just an inch, to reveal the steel beneath the skin. The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Gilded Cage, the city's most pretentious and exclusive dining establishment, turning the streetlights outside into smeared streaks of amber and blood red. Inside, the air smelled of truffle oil, expensive cologne, and the metallic tang of fear that radiated from the staff. Imani stood near the service station, her posture perfect, her face a serene mask of indifference. She adjusted the white apron tied around her waist, her fingers moving with the precision of a surgeon or an assassin. To the manager, a sweating, balding man named Mr. Henderson who treated his ulcers with whiskey and antacids, Imani was a reliable nobody. She was the one who took the shifts no one wanted, who cleaned the messes the high rollers left behind without complaint, and who possessed a face beautiful enough to please the guests, but stoic enough to be forgotten the moment they left. That was the point. Invisibility was not a curse. It was armor. She watched the dining room with eyes that missed nothing, the illicit affair at table 7, the drug deal disguised as a business merger at table 3, and the politician drinking away his conscience at the bar. She was a recording device with a pulse, storing every detail in a mind that had been trained in halls far more dangerous than a fine dining restaurant. The thunder rumbled low and deep, vibrating through the soles of her sensible work shoes, a drumbeat signaling the approach of a storm far more volatile than the weather. The atmosphere in the Gilded Cage shifted the moment the headlights swept across the front entrance. 3 black SUVs, armored and imposing, cut through the rain like sharks parting the ocean, screeching to a halt at the valet stand. The change inside the restaurant was instantaneous and physical. The ambient chatter dropped 3 octaves, the clinking of silverware ceased, and the air conditioning seemed to drop the temperature by 10 degrees. Imani felt the shift on the back of her neck, a prickle of instinct that she hadn't felt since she left her old life behind. The double doors swung open, not by the hands of the guests, but held wide by the terrified valet. Enter the storm. A phalanx of men in sharp, tailored suits entered first, their eyes scanning the room with a practiced paranoia of professional violence. They checked corners, assessed exits, and categorized threats in seconds. And then, walking through the center of them like a king indifferent to the peasants, came Junho. Junho was 36 years old, handsome in a way that was almost offensive to the senses. His features were sharp, carved from cold marble, his eyes dark and abyssal, holding a boredom that was more terrifying than anger. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than the building they were standing in, the fabric cutting a silhouette of absolute authority. He didn't walk. He glided, his movements economical and fluid. He was the head of the Syndic, the organization that currently held the city's underworld in a stranglehold. He was a man who didn't make threats because he was the threat. As he moved toward the private alcove at the back of the room, the obsidian table, the other diners averted their gazes, instinctively understanding that making eye contact with a predator was an invitation to be eaten. Mr. Henderson was practically vibrating with terror as he scurried over to Imani, grabbing her arm with a clammy hand. "You," he hissed, his voice cracking. "Table 12. The obsidian table. You take it. Sarah is in the bathroom crying and David refuses to go near them. Do not mess this up, or you won't just be fired. You'll be erased. Do you understand?" Imani looked down at the manager's hand until he released her, then nodded once. "I understand, sir," she said, her voice smooth and void of the panic he wanted to see. She picked up a tray, checked her reflection in the polished silver, blue dress pristine, apron crisp, and walked into the lion's den. Approaching the table was like walking into a vacuum where the normal laws of social gravity didn't apply. There were 5 men, for were clearly muscle, albeit high-end muscle, wearing suits that struggled to contain their bulk, their hands scarred and heavy on the tablecloth. Junho sat at the head, his back to the wall, facing the room. He didn't look up when Imani arrived. He was busy inspecting the blade of a steak knife, turning it over in his long, elegant fingers as if deciding whether it was sharp enough for his needs. The other men were loud, laughing in a coarse, barking manner, speaking rapidly in their native tongue. They were discussing territory, the breaking of bones, and the displacement of rivals with the casualness of men discussing golf scores. Imani stepped into their circle of violence with the grace of a dancer. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said, her voice a soft alto that cut through their noise without raising in volume. "May I start you with some water, or perhaps a bottle from the cellar?" The table went quiet, but not out of respect. It was the silence of wolves assessing a new intruder. One of the bodyguards, a man with a thick scar running through his left eyebrow, looked her up and down with a sneer that stripped her naked. He said something in his language to the man next to him, a crude comment about her hips and the likely price of her company for an hour. The table erupted in laughter. Imani didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She kept her eyes fixed on the center of the table, her expression one of polite, professional detachment. Junho finally looked up. His gaze hit her like a physical blow, cold, calculating, and utterly dismissive. He didn't see a person, he'd seen an object. "Wine," Junho said in English, his voice a deep baritone that commanded immediate obedience. "The 82 Petrus. And do not pour it if your hands shake." I detest clumsiness. It wasn't a request. It was a challenge. He wanted to see her crack. He wanted to see the tremble of the lower class in the presence of royalty. Imani met his gaze for a fraction of a second too long for a servant, a flash of defiance sparking deep in her pupils before she lowered her head. "As you wish, sir." The ritual of service began. Imani moved with a rhythmic precision that was almost hypnotic. She returned with the bottle, presenting the label with two hands, executing the uncorking with a single, fluid motion that made no sound. The pop of the cork was a whisper. She poured a splash for Junho to taste. The table watched her, waiting for a spill, a slip, a drop to ruin the white linen tablecloth. Junho tasted the wine, his eyes never leaving her face. He swirled the crimson liquid, looking for a flaw in the vintage or a flaw in the girl. Finding neither, he gave a curt nod. She proceeded to fill the glasses. As she moved around the table, the conversation among the men resumed, reverting to their native language. They assumed, with the arrogance of the untouchable, that their words were encrypted by culture. They spoke of a shipment arriving at the docks at midnight. They spoke of a mole in the police department. They spoke of a man named the architect they planned to execute in 3 days. Imani poured the wine, her face a blank canvas, while her mind recorded every name, every time, and every location. She was a spy in the house of the enemy, armed with a wine bottle and a silence that they mistook for stupidity. But the tension was winding tight, a coil ready to snap. The bodyguard with the scar, emboldened by the alcohol and her lack of reaction, decided that verbal abuse wasn't enough. As she reached across to fill his water glass, he deliberately jerked his elbow back. The impact was hard. The crystal pitcher in Imani's hand wobbled, and a splash of ice water cascaded onto the table, soaking the edge of the bodyguard's expensive cuff. It was a setup, a petty power play designed to humiliate her for his own amusement. The reaction was instantaneous. The bodyguard slammed his fist onto the table, rattling the silverware. "You stupid bitch," he roared in English, standing up so abruptly his chair screeched against the floor. The restaurant went dead silent. Every head turned. Mr. Henderson, watching from the kitchen door, turned pale and covered his eyes. Imani stood frozen, the pitcher held firmly in both hands, water dripping from the lip. She didn't apologize immediately. She just looked at the wet spot, then at the man's grinning, malicious face. He wanted her to beg. He wanted her to wipe his sleeve. Junho didn't stand. He didn't even look at his bodyguard. He slowly placed his wine glass down and looked at Imani. The boredom was gone, replaced by a look of profound irritation, not at his man, but at the inconvenience of her existence. He leaned forward, resting his chin on his clasped hands. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. When he spoke, he didn't speak in English. He switched to his native tongue, a linguistic barrier he used to separate the gods from the insects. He spoke softly, with a venomous calm that was far scarier than the bodyguards shouting. He looked right into Imani's eyes and said, in his language, "Look at it. A beautiful, empty vessel. Standing there like a cow in the rain. She has no idea she is dirt. She thinks she is people. It is tragic, really, that we have to breathe the same air as these creatures who are only good for serving and bending over." He paused, a cruel smirk touching the corners of his lips, waiting for the blank stare of confusion, waiting for her to ask, "Excuse me," in her clumsy American tongue. He turned to his men, inviting them to share in the joke, the punchline being her ignorance. "Tell the manager to fire it." Junho continued in his language, waving his hand dismissively at her as if shooing away a fly. "And get me someone who knows not to drip water on my time." The men chuckled, a low, rumbling sound of shared superiority. They turned back to their drinks, the entertainment over, the waitress dismissed, the object discarded. But Imani did not move. She did not retreat. She did not look for the manager. She set the water pitcher down on the service tray with a clink that sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. The sound was sharp, deliberate, and final. It cut through their laughter. Imani stood up to her full height. She wasn't slouching anymore. The submissive curvature of her spine vanished, replaced by the rigid, military-grade posture of a soldier on parade. She took a breath, inhaling the scent of their arrogance, and then she exhaled fire. She looked directly at Junho, locking her gaze with his, violating every social contract of the room. Her eyes were no longer the soft, brown pools of a waitress. They were hard, cold flint. And then she spoke. She didn't speak in English. She spoke in his language. Not the rough, street-slang dialect of the bodyguards, but the high, formal, aristocratic register of the old capital, the dialect of scholars, poets, and emperors. Her pronunciation was flawless, the cadence perfect, the tone dripping with an icy, regal sarcasm that made the air in the room freeze solid. "The cow hears the butcher clearly, sir," she said in his tongue, her voice ringing out like a bell in the silence. "And she notices that for all his expensive suits, the butcher still lacks the manners of a gentleman. If you wish to discuss my worth, do it to my face, not behind the veil of a language you think you own." The effect was catastrophic. The bodyguard with a scar dropped his fork. It hit the plate with a deafening clatter. The laughter died in their throats, choked off by sheer, unadulterated shock. It was as if the table had suddenly grown fangs. But it was Junho's reaction that was the masterpiece. The Mafia boss, the man who feared nothing, the man who looked at the world with bored detachment, froze. His eyes went wide, the pupils blowing out, his mouth parting slightly in a rare, unguarded expression of total disbelief. He looked at her as if she had just pulled a sword from the stone. The power dynamic in the room didn't just shift, it flipped upside down. The servant was gone. The equal had arrived. And she was angry. The silence that followed her declaration was not merely the absence of noise. It was a vacuum, a void that sucked the oxygen out of the room and left everyone gasping. The restaurant, the Gilded Cage, had seen business deals collapse and marriages end, but it had never seen a king stripped naked by a pawn. Junho sat frozen, his hand halfway to his glass, the expensive Swiss watch on his wrist ticking loudly in the sudden quiet. The language she had used was not just fluent. It was archaic, poetic, and steeped in a history that suggested she hadn't just learned it from a textbook, she had lived it, or she had been forged by it. For 10 heartbeats, nobody moved. The rain outside seemed to hammer harder against the glass, a chaotic applause for the coup that had just taken place. Imani did not lower her eyes. She held his gaze with a terrifying stability, her chin lifted, the tray under her arm now looking less like a tool of service and more like a shield. She watched the gears turn behind Junho's dark eyes, watching him recalibrate his entire understanding of reality. He was looking for the wires, the earpiece, the trick. He found none. He only found a woman who was tired of being invisible. Junho slowly placed his hands flat on the table, pushing his chair back inches with a scrape that sounded like a gunshot. The amusement was gone. The boredom was incinerated. In its place was a sharp, predatory focus. He looked at her not as a woman, but as a rival nation. You, he said, switching back to English, though his voice was rougher now, stripped of its smooth veneer. Who are you? It was the only question that mattered. Imani didn't flinch. I am the person who ensures your glass is full, sir, she replied, her voice dropping back to the professional cool of the staff, though the mockery was evident in the subtext. And I am the person who knows that if you send your shipment to the docks at midnight as you discussed, it will be seized by federal agents who have been watching the container since it left the port of origin. The air in the room curdled. The bodyguards stiffened, their hands diving inside their jackets. She had just signed her death warrant, or proved her immense value. She continued, relentless. And the architect you plan to execute? He isn't the mole. The mole is the man sitting 2 seats to your left, sweating through his silk shirt. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. The man she indicated, the one with the nervous tic and the flashy gold ring, jumped to his feet, knocking his chair over. She lies, he screamed, his eyes darting around the room, guilt written in the sweat on his upper lip. But Junho didn't look at his man. He kept his eyes on Imani. He was fascinated. It was a sensation he hadn't felt in years. Genuine, unadulterated surprise. He saw the intelligence behind her eyes, the tactical awareness, the way she had dissected his operation while pouring a vintage red. This was not a waitress. This was a spy, a ghost, a weapon wrapped in a blue dress. Sit down. Junho commanded the panicked underling without looking at him. And you, he said to Imani, standing up slowly, unfolding his height until he towered over the table. You possess a dangerous tongue. Do you know what men like me do to women who know too much? He took a step toward her, crossing the invisible line between patron and server. It was a test of fear. He wanted to see if the facade would crack under physical proximity. Imani didn't retreat. She shifted her weight imperceptibly, grounding herself. I know exactly what men like you do, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear. You underestimate. You assume. And eventually, you die because you were looking at the dress, not the hands. It was a threat delivered with the intimacy of a kiss. The tension was electric, a live wire snapping between them. The restaurant staff was huddled in the kitchen, terrified, but out on the floor, a strange chemistry was brewing. It wasn't just fear, it was recognition. Game recognizes game. Junho tilted his head, studying her face as if it were a map to a buried treasure. You are not safe here anymore, he murmured. You have just made yourself a player in a game you cannot win. Imani smiled, a cold, humorless curvature of lips. I didn't start playing just now, Junho. I've been winning since you walked in the door. The spell was broken by the brute. The bodyguard with a scar, the one who had spilled the water, could not process the nuance of the standoff. He only understood that a servant had disrespected his master and that she was still standing. His primitive logic dictated that violence was the only eraser for this kind of shame. With a guttural roar, he lunged across the space between them, his heavy hand aiming for Imani's throat. It was a clumsy, alcohol-fueled attack, telegraphed from a mile away. To a normal waitress, it would have been terrifying. To Imani, it was slow motion. The room gasped as the mountain of a man descended on the woman in the blue dress, expecting to see her crushed. Mr. Henderson screamed from the kitchen doorway. But the scream died in his throat as the laws of physics seemed to bend around table 12. Imani didn't step back. She stepped in. It is the hallmark of elite combat training. Move into the fire, not away from it. As the bodyguard's hand grasped for her windpipe, she pivoted on her left heel, her movement fluid and serpentine. She caught his wrist with her left hand, using his own forward momentum against him, and with her right hand, she grabbed a heavy silver fork from the table. In one blur of motion, she drove the handle of the fork, not the tines, she was precise, not messy, into the nerve cluster just under his armpit. The man yelped, his arm going numb instantly. She didn't stop. She spun him around, locking his arm behind his back in a hammerlock that forced him to bend double. With a sharp kick to the back of his knee, she dropped the 300-pound man to the floor. He hit the hardwood with a thud that rattled the wine glasses. She stood over him, not a hair out of place, her breathing even. She still held the silver fork, twirling it casually in her fingers like a baton. I believe, she said to the groaning man on the floor. That you dropped this. She placed the fork gently on the table next to his face. The violence had lasted 3 seconds. The silence that followed was absolute. The other 3 bodyguards had drawn their guns, leveling them at her chest. The patrons of the Gilded Cage were now diving under tables. But Junho raised a hand, a sharp, cutting gesture that froze his men in place. "Lower them," he ordered. His eyes were wide, shining with a dark, intense delight. He looked at his fallen man, then at Imani, and a slow, appreciative smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a man who had just found a diamond in a pile of coal. "Aikido?" Junho asked, ignoring the guns, ignoring the screaming diners. He walked around the table, circling her like a shark. Or perhaps Krav Maga. The efficiency suggests military. The restraint suggests intelligence. He stopped in front of her, close enough to smell the soap on her skin, a stark contrast to the violence she had just dispensed. "Who trained you? The CIA? Me 6. He was trying to categorize her, to put her in a box. He understood. Imani adjusted her apron, smoothing out a wrinkle caused by the scuffle. "Does it matter?" she asked. "The water is cleaned up. The trash is on the floor. Would you like dessert?" Her refusal to be impressed by him was driving him insane in the best possible way. He laughed, a genuine, deep sound that startled his men more than the fight had. "No dessert," he said. "I want to buy you." "I'm not for sale," Imani replied instantly, her eyes hard. "And neither is my silence. But I will give you some free advice." She nodded toward the front window, where the rain was sheeting down. "The couple at table 7. They haven't touched their food in 20 minutes. They've been watching you in the reflection of the glass. And the valet outside? He ran away 5 minutes ago." Junho's smile vanished. He snapped his head toward the window. The street was empty. The ominous feeling of the storm suddenly felt very specific. "Ambush," he whispered. He looked back at Imani, realizing that while he was playing power games, she was assessing the tactical perimeter. She hadn't just humiliated him. She was saving him. "Why tell me?" he asked. "Why not let them kill me?" Imani looked at the door. "Because they didn't tip," she said dryly. "And I hate a mess." The first bullet shattered the front window before the sentence was finished. It wasn't a warning shot. It was a kill shot. The glass exploded inward in a shower of diamond shards, mixing with the rain to create a deadly mist. The round took the head off the flower vase on the center of their table. Chaos erupted. The Gilded Cage transformed from a fine dining establishment into a kill box in a fraction of a second. The couple, at table 7, flipped their table, drawing automatic weapons from a gym bag beneath it. The front doors were kicked open by masked men in tactical gear. The sound was deafening. The roar of gunfire, the shattering of crystal, the screams of the wealthy. Junho was fast, flipping the heavy oak table to create a barricade, dragging Imani down with him. But she was already moving. "Kitchen." Imani shouted over the noise of the submachine guns. "The back exit leads to the alley." She wasn't waiting for him to lead. She was taking command. She grabbed a steak knife from the floor, the very one Junho had inspected earlier, and threw it with terrifying accuracy. It struck the gunman from table 7 in the shoulder, buying them a second of suppressive fire. Junho's men were returning fire, but they were pinned down. The traitor, the man Imani had identified, tried to run toward the attackers, shouting, "I'm with you," only to be cut down by the crossfire. There is no honor among thieves, and there is no mercy in a firefight. Junho pulled his own weapon, a sleek, silver pistol, and fired 2 controlled shots over the barricade. He looked at Imani, crouching beside him in the debris of wine and glass. She didn't look scared. She looked alive. "You have a gun?" she asked, eyeing his weapon. "Give me the spare." Junho looked at her, the adrenaline surging through his veins. He reached to his ankle holster and pulled out a compact backup piece, sliding it across the floor to her. She checked the chamber with a practiced snap. "Cover me," she ordered. The absurdity of the situation hit him, the Mafia boss taking orders from the waitress. But he didn't argue. He popped up and laid down a suppressing spray of bullets. Imani moved. She didn't run. She flowed. She used the cover of the booths, moving low and fast, flanking the attackers who were focused on Junho. She moved like a shadow, emerging on their flank. 2 shots, 2 drops. She was efficient, brutal, and utterly calm. She cleared the path to the kitchen. "Go," she signaled. Junho and his 2 surviving bodyguards scrambled toward the kitchen doors. The kitchen was a labyrinth of stainless steel and steam. Cooks were cowering in the walk-in freezer. Imani led them through the maze, kicking open the heavy steel back door into the rain-slicked alley. The storm was raging now, the thunder drowning out the sirens wailing in the distance. They spilled out into the wet darkness, gasping for air. Junho leaned against the brick wall, rain plastering his hair to his face, his suit ruined. He looked at Imani. She stood in the rain, the blue dress soaked, the gun held loosely at her side. She looked like a goddess of war. "You saved my life," Junho said, the rain dripping from his chin. He was breathless, not from exertion, but from the revelation of her. He stepped toward her, the danger of the night acting as a potent aphrodisiac. "You come with me. Now. I can protect you. I can give you the world." It was an offer of partnership, of power, of something darker and more intense. He reached out a hand, offering her a place at his side, on the throne of the underworld. The bodyguards watched, stunned. This was unprecedented. The king was bowing to the queen. Imani looked at his hand, then up at his face. The sirens were getting closer. Blue and red lights flashed against the brick walls, illuminating her face in strobe-like bursts. She engaged the safety on the gun and wiped her prints off it with the hem of her apron before tossing it into a dumpster. "I don't want your world, Junho," she said, her voice cutting through the storm. "It's too small." She backed away, moving toward the shadows of the alley exit. "And I don't need your protection. I survived you, didn't I?" "Wait," Junho shouted, desperation cracking his voice. "At least tell me your name." "Your real name." He stepped forward, but she was already fading into the darkness, blending with the night, as if she were made of it. She stopped for 1 second, turning back. The streetlights caught the reflection in her eyes, hard, triumphant, and free. "Imani," she said. "It means faith. Have some," and then she was gone, vanished into the city that eats people alive. Junho stood alone in the rain, surrounded by the wreckage of his evening, realizing he had just met the only thing in the world he couldn't control. 6 months later, the skyline of the city had not changed, but the balance of power within it had shifted. Junho sat in his office at the top of the obsidian tower, looking out at the sprawling metropolis through bulletproof glass. The city was a grid of lights, a circuit board of corruption and commerce. He was more powerful now than he had been that night at the restaurant. The traitor was dead, the architect was neutralized, and his grip on the territory was absolute. Yet, on his desk, in the center of the mahogany expanse, sat a cheap, stainless steel fork. It was the only flaw in the perfection of his office. He picked it up, feeling the weight of it, remembering the woman who had wielded it like Excalibur. He had searched. God, how he had searched. He had turned the city upside down. He had tortured informants, bribed government officials, and hacked databases. He found nothing. No record of her employment, no address, no trace. It was as if she had materialized from the rain that night and dissolved back into it. But he knew she was out there. Sometimes, he felt eyes on him when he walked to his car. Sometimes, he saw a flash of blue in a crowd. He knew she was watching. He knew she was the check on his power, the ghost in the machine, the reminder that he was not a god. And in the quiet of the night, he found himself wishing for another storm, just to see if the lightning would strike twice. He spun the fork on the desk. It was waiting. He was waiting. But what about you? You sit there, watching the screen, safe in your world of comfort. You see the waitress, the cleaner, the driver, the person in the background blurring into the scenery. You ignore them. You dismiss them. You think power is a suit, a title, a bank account. You think you know who holds the cards. But let me ask you this. When the storm comes, and it always comes, who do you want standing next to you? The man who can buy the building, or the woman who knows how to burn it down? Look closer at the people you ignore. That quiet girl pouring your coffee might be the only thing standing between you and the abyss. Or she might be the one pushing you in. So, The next time you feel the urge to be rude to the help, to snap your fingers, to look down on someone serving you, don't. Because you never know who is wearing the apron. You never know when the wolf is dressed in wool. And by the time you realize your mistake, it will be too late to apologize. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories from the shadows. The city has a million stories, and I see them all. Until next time, keep your eyes open. You never know who's watching.